Hello and welcome to round 8 of the Menorca Open, the second to last round of the event. So you saw in the previous videos we were entering this round with a decent score. I think we had 4.5 out of 7 now, something like that going in, for a slight rating gain. But this was probably the most important game of the tournament because I think this would decide pretty much if this was a good or bad event for me. We had the black pieces against a very, very strong opponent, a young player, Jacob Simon, I'm not really sure how it's pronounced, but very famous player, famously won the world under 16 or 18, something like that, junior championship last year. It was a famous video of him being received at his school after the tournament, the hero returning from battle sort of thing. It was very wholesome. Probably will be a Grandmaster soon. So actually, apparently he's only Phoenix Master. I'm shocked he's not an IM. That must be out of date. But a very, very, very strong player, for sure. And so I was looking forward to this game a little bit, but also a little bit nervous because this is probably, like, on paper, not exactly the type of person you want to have the black pieces against. My opponent started with d4, knight f6, d4, e6, knight f3. I didn't do any real preparation for this game because my opponent has played a wide variety of things. But before the tournament, I had spent a lot of time looking at this a6 variation. Not really for use against higher rated players. This was much more designed as a weapon for lower rated players to avoid the Catalan, which is notoriously drawish, if the white player wants it to be. But since I had spent so much time looking at this, I figured, okay, I haven't had the chance to play this yet. Nobody lower rated has tried to play the Catalan against me. Why not? Let's try it. Let's just see what happens. If we go down in flames, it's fine. We built ourselves a little bit of a buffer in the tournament by winning the previous game. And I really want to be able to try this. I don't want to go the whole trip without having prepared this, for months and not having any opportunity to really get to try it out. So kind of on a whim, I decided to play this a6 variation. In hindsight, this is probably a little bit over-optimistic, but as we'll see, it did kind of work out. Oh, I should also warn you all before we get into this game that I am a little bit stupid. We did end up winning this game, but I am a little bit stupid. You'll see why when we get to it. But I need to I need to preemptively ask for your all's forgiveness for subjecting you to what is going to be one of the worst moves in possibly chess history, demonstrated on the board. I'll I'll let you recognize where it is. I don't think it's going to be very, very hard, but you are all allowed to make fun of me, with the sort of warning that by seeing it, you will probably become worse at the game by osmosis. But anyway, we started with a6. This is a very, very funny looking move. It doesn't, visually it looks very bizarre. It looks like a complete beginner move. Why are we dedicating time to a6 in the opening? The point basically is to, like I said, to avoid the Catalan. If white plays for this g3 system without c4, for example, g3 here, as a means of entering the Catalan, black can just continue with the Catalan approach, play d5, bishop g2, bishop e7, c4, and so on. This is all very mainline Catalan stuff. But black also has the option of, since the bishop is already committed to g2, and there's less pressure along this diagonal, black has the option of playing this also odd-looking move b5, which is very popular and has a pretty good reputation, actually, not just for playing for a win against lower-rated players, but even objectively. This prevents white from playing c4 for probably ever, and even though this pawn would usually be weak, because white would like to move the e-pawn anyway to develop his pieces, and now he's going to be able to do it with tempo. Now, usually in the Catalan, white doesn't actually want to move this pawn very early. If he does, it's going to be much later and after the bishop's developed on g2. So if white wants to put pressure on this pawn, he's going to have to actually take time to do it with something like a4 or, knight a3. At which point, black is not really upset at spending time defending the pawn because white has also invested a tempo to deal with it. And so the idea of as you might imagine, of a6 in this position is that it renews the idea of b5. So if white commits to g3 and wants to punch through a Catalan, now once again we can play b5, and though we haven't stopped c4, we're sort of immediately challenging it. If white is forced to take, then Black is very, very happy. The a file is open. Black sort of indirectly has gained a little bit extra control over the center. And if white spends time defending it with something like b3, now black's development comes very, very naturally. If their bishop g2, like c5, for example, black has basically no problems. So a6 essentially prevents the Catalan entirely if white doesn't want to just allow equality out of the opening. And so white generally goes for knight c3, sort of changing course and playing in a Queen's Gambit decline style, where a6 is supposedly a bit less of a useful move. But the sort of innovation here, this is what my opponent played, the quote-unquote innovation here is that after d5, it turns out this a6 move is actually pretty useful, because now we are threatening to take on c4. This is, if white plays like bishop f4, for example, again in Queen's Gambit style, we can actually probably go ahead and take, because we're able to support this pawn immediately with the move b5. This is still a line, there's, stuff. But generally, white doesn't go for that, and instead goes ahead and takes on d5, aiming for a Carlsbad position where, again, a6 shouldn't be a useful move in principle. It's useful to compare this to, like, after c4, e6, if white goes for knight c3 immediately. After d5, takes, bishop g5. This is all, like, a very main line, for example. Bishop e7, e3, c6, bishop d3, knight d7, knight f3, castle, like, many, many games in this sort of position. Both sides are doing quite well, but you'll notice that a6 is not really contributing anything at all. Black will almost never play a6 in a position like this, and it's not really clear what the purpose of it would even be. We don't need it to support b5. If we want to play b5, which black sometimes doesn't do in this line, even though it looks weakening, we don't need the pawn on a6 for it. And if we want to restrict the advance of the pawns with, like, b4, a4, b5, whatever, the much more natural way to do it is to play a5 in one move. And so aiming for the Carlsbad type structure makes a lot of sense, because this pawn on a6 ostensibly is not really relevant. So after bishop g5, first of all, we already need to deal with the threat of the threat to this pawn, and it's actually very unpleasant to do so. If we continue with bishop e7 immediately, then after takes queen b3, suddenly we have quite a bit of trouble actually dealing with this pawn. If we have to play c6, then this bishop starts to feel very uncomfortable, and we don't really want to play both c6 and d6 and a6 in the opening. So generally, black instead plays bishop e6, which is a bit of a strange-looking move. The bishop is, very, very passively placed here. But the intended setup that we're going to go for is something similar to, what my opponent played against me in round 3, which is to put the bishop on d6 and leave the pawn on c7, so that pressure along the c file is a little bit less relevant. We'll put this knight on d7, we'll castle, we'll maybe put this knight on b6 even is a plan. And so, for example, after e3, bishop d6, bishop d3, knight d7, castle, there's a few ways that black can play this. Magnus has played queen e7 a lot here. Many people have played castles, intending c6 and queen c7. And black has a number of ideas. One is to play, for example, like b5, knight b6, knight c4 is one idea. Sometimes if white ends up playing bishop f4 and exchanging the direct square bishops, black can maneuver the knight to e4 in sort of a very roundabout way for b6 and then c8. And overall, black is doing, like, okay. White is considerably better, I would say, objectively, but black is holding on. Another modern idea that after bishop e6, one clear downside to the move bishop e6 is that we lose support of the b7 pawn. And so it's a very natural question to say, what happens if white goes after it immediately with something like queen b3? And this is where sort of the final point of a6 is revealed. We've seen 3 points of it now. Against the Catalan, it supports b5. Against the Carlsbad, it sets up this kind of structure. So we don't need to play c6, basically. So that's one point. It, like, prevents us from needing to play c6. Sometimes that means we can play c5 in one move. Sometimes that means we can stick with this more solid structure, whatever. But the third and final point is that we can defend against queen b3 in this very strange, bizarre-looking way with the move rook to a7. It opens up the a7 square for the rook. And as it turns out, this configuration, sort of as odd as it looks, is very, very solid for black, and the queen is kind of misplaced here. So the modern way to try to salvage this idea for white, if they want, which is what my opponent tried in this game, is to first take on f6, basically saying, okay, my dark square bishop's going to be the bad one once I play e3. All my pawns are dark squares anyway. It's not like I really want this bishop. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to do this now while I force your queen to come out into the open. So you don't have time to play like knight d7 or something and take back with the knight. And only then am I going to go for queen b3. People have tried this. I think most notably there's a Ding-Loren game in this line. That was pretty important. But again, black has to play the same idea, rook a7, and after h4, we reach kind of one of the three main lines, I would say, of this a6 variation. Now, which I knew a little bit here, I didn't remember all of the details, but a lot of the point here is that white would like to play for e4. Obviously, since we've played rook a7, black is never going to castle queenside. It's not legal. The king is going to have to go to the king's side. And so white is going to try to start some sort of attack, e3, knight g5, bishop d3, eventually play for e4 to bring this knight into the battle as well. Possibly castle queenside, or not even possibly, probably castle queenside. Start playing like rook g1, g4, and just go for a very, very powerful attack, utilizing the fact that this bishop is out of play for the moment. It's just, like we said, it's staring into air. This rook is very out of play for the moment, and by committing to this sort of setup, we've also spent some time getting these pieces to pretty bad squares, so white has a bit of a developmental advantage. Even though white has spent 2 moves to trade off a piece, white has committed a move to h4. The attack can be very, very, very powerful. So black basically needs to continue his development. This is mandatory. I played bishop d6. My opponent played e3. Again, bishop d3 is the obvious point. Knight d7, bishop d3. Now, it's, I guess, a point I haven't mentioned is that this pawn hasn't really been under attack yet, because, for example, if white takes here, then after queen f5 is a very simple pin that is unbreakable. Once the bishop comes to d3, now this is an actual threat, because we don't have the f5 square for the queen anymore, and so we do need to defend this pawn. We played c6. My opponent played queen c2, attacking this pawn. Now you might think that this is not a real threat to the pawn, because if white takes, let's say we play rook a8, trying to get the rook back into the game. If white takes, then we have the typical way of trapping the bishop with g6. And that would be true under some circumstances, but in this case, white can defend this bishop with knight g5, and white will be able to play h5 to free the bishop fairly quickly. Plus, even if white has to sacrifice a piece in a lot of these lines, it's really not that big a deal. For example, e4 here is a very serious consideration already. Now, whether that means white can take here immediately or not, I'm not 100% sure. It's possible that the tactics do work out after takes g6. But there's also knight g5 to worry about, maybe even putting the knight on h7, as weird as that looks. There's also, e4 immediately to worry about. And so I decided that it would be much simpler to just resolve all of these problems immediately and play the move h6, especially because we're going to need to castle eventually anyway, so this move will eventually have to be played. My opponent went ahead and castled queenside, I castled kingside, king b1 was played. This is probably the first moment that I didn't really like my opponent's move. Up until now, I think all the moves have been pretty automatic, but here there are things to consider. First of all, knight g5 is a very real move that needs to be analyzed. Black, of course, cannot take, because after check, king h8, take on g5, something very violent is about to happen along the h-file. For example, if we take, bishop g8 is basically just checkmate on the spot. So we're not able to take the knight. We have to deal with this threat of knight h7, forking the queen and the rook. So we probably have to play the move rook e8. And now something like e4 starts to really ramp up the pressure. And I was a little... I couldn't really remember if this was supposed to be okay for black or not, but I was definitely pretty scared of it during the game. So I was pretty happy to see king b1 because it seemed a little bit slow. And black really only needs like one move or so for the position to look pretty consolidated. So I thought that king b1 was probably giving me the one tempo I needed, especially because it's not really. I wasn't really sure what king b1 is accomplishing. Yes, the king does often belong on b1 when it castles queenside. In fact, almost all of the time, king b1 can never be that bad a move. But in this particular case, it's not like, after e4, it's not like he's really concerned about something coming to f4 and giving a check. The king would just go to b1 then. So I wasn't sure what this was stopping. The a2 pawn also doesn't need any more support or anything, which is another reason that sometimes the king slides over to b1. There's also no like c-file opening. It's not like we're really playing c5. So overall, I think this was probably a bit of a slow move, and that gave me the time I needed to consolidate things. So I played bishop g4. I wasn't quite sure if I'm actually taking on f3, but this does slow white down quite a bit because the knight can't move now. And I would like to go to g5, of course, like we were talking about, but now, because of the pin, it's not so simple. I was considering taking and then not taking the pawn. For example, if like white plays, I don't know, yeah, let's say rook g1, for example, I was considering the idea of like takes and just for k8 here, for example. Or probably grabbing the pawn is a little bit too greedy, but by forcing the pawn to move to f3, we prevent any ideas of like g4, g5. And now this queen is very, very stable on f6 and a very strong defensive piece. So I thought that maybe this would be a pretty solid position for black. My opponent instead played e4, which I kind of expected. This is probably white's main idea in the position, but it is very double-edged. It introduces an isolated pawn in exchange for some immediate initiative. But if the initiative fizzles out, then, black has two bishops, the position is opening up, which is great. There's an isolated pawn on d4, which is going to be very, very difficult to go forward, which is great. And white's king is not entirely safe either. Black's... we've been talking all about, like, this attack that white is going to generate, but right now there's not really any pieces by black's king. It's not really in any big danger. But if the position opens up, and for example, we get to put a bishop on f6 on the long diagonal or something, and we get to put a bishop on f5 along these diagonals. We can maybe play like a5, a4, a3. There are dreams of an attack for the black side as well. So it's a very double-edged move. I was unhappy to see it. Of course, we have to take, though, because otherwise white plays e5, gaining a lot of space. Knight takes e4, and now queen f4 is a very, very annoying thorn in white's side here. And I think this is part of the reason that king b1 was such an inaccuracy, because now this setup makes it really difficult for white to generate any play. The queen is really comfortable here. It's very difficult to dislodge. G3 is almost never going to be possible because this knight is always going to be a little bit undefended. And in the meantime, black is just sort of, very happy to play knight f6, very happy to slide the bishop, rook back into the game, sort of whatever black wants. So at this point, I started to feel very comfortable with the position, and I even started to feel like, okay, maybe we can start to get ambitious even. My opponent played rook dg1. It's a bit of a mysterious-looking move because g4, of course, is not possible with the pieces in the way, but this does break the pin, and it discourages taking on f3 as well, because now the g-file will be open. I consider this nonetheless in sort of the same idea of just not taking this pawn, but leaving, preventing any idea of the g-pawn moving, and then here maybe playing like knight f6, for example. But I thought that it was probably better to just start with knight f6 immediately. No reason to start with knight f3. This did allow my opponent to play the move knight g5, which I didn't entirely overlook, I would say, but maybe I underestimated during the game. This would have been maybe a reason to start with taking on f3 or something. Now, I thought during the game, probably the idea is that if I take, pawn takes, if we take here, takes, now, bishop h7 and bishop g8 is, again, a big threat. For example, if we just take on g5, then we run into this problem. And once again, mate is going to be delivered very swiftly. And we can't play g6 to shut down the diagonal because white just takes it anyway. I did consider this anyway because like rook c8 or rook e8 for example is possible. Trying to remember what was scaring me here. There's definitely something. Takes. Maybe I was scared of taking out a 6 first. Yeah, I guess there's also this to consider. We can't take with the queen because of the same operation as before. So we would have to take with the pawn, and then after takes, the king is very, very open. Was this the problem? To be honest, I don't really remember, because I remember discarding taking the knight so quickly that I don't actually remember what the immediate issue with it was, but it definitely looks very, very scary. Possibly it's a bluff, I guess. I haven't actually checked. But, okay, well, I guess let's look at this again. So rook e8 is the only way to not get mated. There's f3. I guess it's not really threatening this, though. Well, it kind of is, because it's threatening here and then takes. So the bishop does kind of have to move. Maybe back to e6 or something. Well, I guess even this looks pretty safe. I'm gonna have to cheat a bit. What was the point? Oh, right, yeah, g3 first is a very, very big problem. The queen doesn't really have a good square now. And if we go to f3 now white can very comfortably take this, because if takes on e4, the queen is being hit as well. Actually, it seems like a lot of things work, though. Even rook e1, which is a really bizarre move. But anyway, I mean, taking is obviously not really serious anyway. Like, even if it doesn't lose on the spot, it's certainly not going to be better for black. So I went ahead and just took on e4, like a normal person. Well, I went ahead and took back, and now I decided to preserve the bishop. We don't necessarily have to do this, I don't think, but it does get out of any g3 issues. You know, opens a path back for the queen. The other option was probably to play, like, rook d8, I guess. But then after g3, we have to go to f3, and this can start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. The queen is very, very short of squares. I thought, like, rook e1, for example. Now bishop e2 is a threat. I guess there's also takes and queen c5, maybe? Well, okay, maybe not immediately, because takes and queen d4. But that's an idea that's in the air. So I thought bishop e7 was probably the safest. I'm going to play f3, forcing the bishop back, and trying to start making use of this rook. Bishop e6, queen e2. This is just defending the pawn to start playing g4 and stuff. Rook d8. Attacking the isolated pawn. And now we can start to see what I was talking about. You know, white has an isolated pawn, it's very weak. It's also very well controlled. It's never going to be able to go forward safely. We have full control over the square in front of the isolated pawn. And white's king is, it starts to feel a little uncomfortable. You know, we have some pieces starting to swarm towards it. This knight is currently on e4, which holds the f6 square. But if the bishop gets to f6, then we're starting to point our pieces a little bit towards this king. And so even though all of white's forces are, you know, really, it's not really subtle what their intentions are, we are not without ideas of our own. And at least for the moment, the king side is very, very safe, so we can just go ahead and try to go ahead and grab this pawn. Which, among other things, you know, first of all, it's a pawn, but it also starts to open up the position around white's king pretty substantially. You know, if we manage to double on the d file and get like a rook to d2, then we have attacking possibilities. If we manage to get the bishop to a long diagonal that becomes open with this pawn gone, then we have attacking possibilities. So I was feeling very good here. I thought I had very, very good chances. Not just to equalize, but to be better. My opponent played g3, going back to c7, and then played g4. Again, not being very subtle with the intentions. White just wants to really crash through, given that, you know, we do still have pieces stuck on the queen side that are very difficult to become defenders, and white really has no other idea. I mean, these pieces need to be made use of somehow, or things are just going to collapse. This is a pawn sacrifice, of course. We can take on d4, which we did. We played queen a5 first to activate the queen a little, using the mate threat, and provoke b3, which is weakening the queen side a little bit. But now we go ahead and grab the pawn. My opponent played g5. Again, what else? Kind of have to. I played h5, obviously want to keep the position closed. And after g6, this was probably one of the critical moments, because this does look very scary. Looks like white is very, very close to crashing through. But I figured going into this that it's not really clear how white does do that. You know, it looks scary. The g file is going to open up. We can't really move the f pawn. You know, we would like to play like f6 and keep everything closed, for example, but white has tactics available to deny that idea entirely. So the g file will open up. But the question is, what then? You know, okay, the g file is open, like, so what? You know, you do have to do something with it, and the one file probably isn't going to be enough to generate an attack all by itself. So I decided I probably had time to get away with a very calm move, rook a8, which is just reactivating the pieces. You know, it does add a little bit to the defense, but it's also just ready to go to d8 and start aiming for counterplay as well. My opponent took on f7, again, what else? Takes. And here my opponent, we were in pretty serious time pressure at this point, but mostly my opponent. I think I still had like 10-15 minutes, but my opponent used pretty much all his remaining time on this move, because it's not clear how to continue the attack. You know, if white plays queen g2, which is a very caveman approach, just trying to deliver checkmate, then, you know, we don't really have queen e5 immediately because of f4, distracting the queen. But after something simple like g6, it's not really clear how white is crashing through, and in the meantime, you know, we are attacking pieces. There is just stuff that white needs to deal with. So my opponent spent a lot of his remaining time, pretty much all of it, and instead played bishop c2, just trying to preempt the threat to this bishop a little bit. I played rook d8, again, you know, just keeping the plan. Doubling on the d file, preparing, you know, something like rook d2. I'm not sure if rook d2 actually works in this immediate position, but the idea is now in the air. And now again, if queen g2, we'll play like g6, rook d2 is coming, you know, lots of counter threats, and in the meantime, white doesn't really have time to. White would have to move the knight to generate pressure on this pawn, and he's just not really in time to do that. So my opponent said play knight g5, which I thought made sense, but at this point I started to find I found what I thought was a very, very nice solution, and this is about where I'm going to demonstrate my complete idiocy. White, of course, is threatening to take on f7 as the main idea, removing a very, very critical defender and trying to continue the attack that way. White is also, of course, attacking this bishop immediately, which is just hanging. So we don't have time for a move like rook d2 or something. If we play, my initial instinct was to play something like, well, my initial instinct was just to take on g5 for going into the position. I thought this might be forced, but now this allows white to double on the g file, and things start to look a little bit unpleasant. It's looking at stuff like queen c3, rook g1, and then moving this rook somewhere, like maybe not d2 because then queen e4 or something, but maybe like f4 or something. I don't know, just trying to defend this pawn. But it looked a little sketchy, so I was starting to get a little bit concerned. But I found a very nice solution here, I thought, which was this very powerful move, bishop f6. And now the point is we're generating a lot of counter chances. If knight takes f7, we're not going to take back. If we took back, bishop g6, king f8, rook e1 is now threatening mate. We have to be pretty careful here. But we're not going to take back. We're going to instead play this very powerful move, queen c3. And now we are threatening checkmate, which is a little subtle, the way that we're threatening checkmate, because if white goes ahead and grabs this rook, you know, it looks like, oh, we play rook d1 and we deliver checkmate on one of these two squares. But after bishop d1, turns out, you know, there is no mate. We just sacrificed all our pieces for no reason. But we are sacrificing all of our pieces for an actual reason, which is this really nice move, queen a1, and after it takes rook d1, the king is destroyed by the only two remaining pieces that black has not sacrificed. So it would have been a pretty satisfying conclusion. And so my opponent saw this, and instead of knight f7, played the move knight h7, trying to contest this very, very powerful dark square bishop. And this is where I need to apologize to all of you, anybody who's still here, because after seeing my next move, I don't think any of you will be here. This is a good puzzle for you to pause the video, I guess, and, you know, black to play and win. I'm not going to wait too long because you probably solved it by now. You might not even have to pause the video. This position did occur on the board. I want to be clear, this was not a theoretical variation that was in either of our heads. This was on the physical board in front of us. And with 10 minutes on my clock, I did not play queen takes a2, delivering checkmate in 3 moves. I completely missed this. I had no idea, because I'm a little bit stupid. And instead, I played the defensive move, queen e5. The only saving grace for me there, after this, is that I didn't know this until the end of the game. At the end of the game, my opponent was like, you know you missed mate in 3, right? And I had to be like, what? What do you... Oh, I did miss mate in 3, didn't I? That would have been good, wouldn't it? Fortunately, queen e5 is still good, I guess. I mean, not in comparison to mate in 3, but it doesn't spoil anything just yet. White is forced to take on f6. We take back. Want to play rook g5. And now, you know, white still has a little bit of an attack going, but it's pretty easy to meet at this point, so black is just up a pretty comfortable pawn. The only question is if it's enough to win the game. It's a matter of technique at this point, as they say. Played rook d5. This is just trading off some pieces now. Takes, queen c3. I thought was pretty important. Generating some counter threats of our own, and so we're forcing white to do the exchanges for us. You know, it's not obvious how black gets the pieces off, but if we generate our own threats, then white has to be the one to force the exchanges. So a5 I thought was a really nice idea. We're just going to play a4 and a3, and that forces white to trade the queens. After which I thought this should be relatively straightforward, but I wasn't sure. So I'm curious what people think about this. If you have an opinion, leave it in the comments. If you saw this position like in a game against somebody, you know, maybe slightly stronger than yourself, how confident would you be on a scale of 1 to 10 that you were going to win this game? I think during the game, I kind of underrated my chances a bit. I kind of thought this was like a 6 or a 7 out of 10, I guess. I mean, obviously I can't lose, but I thought this was a 6 or a 7 out of 10. Probably it's a lot higher than that. It should be pretty hard not to win this position, even though I did kind of find a way to do it. I played bishop d5. This obviously puts pressure on the pawn, but it also keeps the rook out, so it reduces some counterplay. f4, started bringing the king in, both sides. My opponent played b4, and now all of white's pawns are in dark squares, so they are a little bit harder to attack. I played rook e3, intending to go attack them anyway. My opponent continued with b5. This is just trying to activate the rook a bit. Played rook h3, takes. f5 is pretty much forced to defend the pawn. I played king e5. I'm actually not sure about this move. The other idea I could have tried was like rook g3 and rook g4, but actually I don't know what I didn't like about that. At this point we were both in like very heavy time pressure. I think we were both playing up basically an increment, so I forgive myself a little bit for any inaccuracies, but not really sure what my concern was about this. I guess bishop d1, but oh, I guess even, yeah, I guess this isn't so obvious. Takes. Yeah, okay, I guess either way we're just going to be trading some pawns. So I played king e5. I decided I wanted to trade this pawn for this pawn instead of this pawn for this pawn. Maybe it doesn't make a lot of a difference. Rook a4, c5. We're trying to make use of our pass pawn. Rook a7, trading these two pawns. And here I spent, I think, basically all of my remaining time and decided to liquidate into the rook endgame with bishop to e4. I wasn't 100% sure this was winning, but I just kind of assumed it was, to be honest. I was hesitant to play it because I wasn't 100% sure, but I was like 80-90% sure that this was winning. Importantly, white is forced to take. White doesn't have like rook e7 or anything because we do just grab this pawn, and then the rest is pretty straightforward. One important detail is that rook and h against rook is winning as long as the king gets cut off along the d file. So for example, if we played rook e7 takes, let's say like rook c7 for example, there's not really any reason to do it this way, but we could do this, play rook d4, and this would be, I believe, winning for black. Because eventually what happens is, you know, just to illustrate, eventually what happens is the king gets stuck in the corner, like this, but the question, like, what Black's plan is to free the king like this, and so the question is how far away the king is. With the king cut off this far away, it's just enough to get the king out in time. It's still a little bit complicated, if I remember correctly, because this ends in, like, queen versus rook somehow. I don't entirely remember the details of how that happens. I guess it's with king d6 is the better try. This here, like, check, we have to go here or something. Check here, threaten mate. This is all very well known, and now check rook c6. Yeah, rook c6 to make sure we queen a check. Takes queen, and we have queen versus rook, which is notoriously a little bit of a difficult win, but in these types of positions it's actually quite easy because the king and the rook are so far apart that we end up forking the pieces very, very quickly. So this is an important thing to know, and it's slightly important for the evaluation of the endgame, is that as long as the king is cut off 3 ranks away, it is winning. If we were 1 file closer, then it would be a draw, because now we're not in time to do this anymore. The rook will just, like, go somewhere, and the king is keeping this king stuck. So that's a very important detail for the evaluation of this rook endgame, and that's part of the reason that I felt very confident that this should be winning, because now if we do trade these 2 pawns, we should be able to cut off the king in time to win the game. But this configuration is actually a little bit difficult to break, because if we trade these 2 pawns, it's a very easy draw under most circumstances, as long as the king is managing to stay in front of the pawn, because we'll reach sort of naturally a Philidor position. For example, if we just go ahead and directly trade these pawns, this is a very, very famous and extremely easy draw for white to make. White just keeps the rook on this file until we're forced to move the pawn forward, and then as soon as we move the pawn forward, white brings the rook behind the king and just checks forever. And this king, because the pawn is advanced, the king doesn't have time to get in front of it to use it as shelter. But I was pretty confident this was winning, because my thought process was, okay, you know, eventually we're just going to run the king up, support the c-pawn as much as we can. Sure, we'll trade these 2 pawns, but it'll be at a moment where this pawn is very, very far advanced, and we should win without too much trouble. I did make some kind of random moves to gain some time first. You know, we repeated once or twice. But now my idea was that after c4, king c3, rook f4, this was the position that I had foreseen when I played bishop e4. Now white's in a bit of a zugzwang. White can't move the rook, really. If rook g5, we just take with the rook. If rook anywhere else, we take with the king. So the king has to go back. And once the king goes back, then we can jump forward with the king. f6 is trying to trade the pawns, but we'll force the king back, threaten checkmate, and then only then trade the pawns when this king is very, very far advanced and white doesn't have time to set up the Philidor. Apparently, as it turns out, white can actually hold this position for some wizardry. The only move for white to hold this position is this very bizarre looking move, king b2. It's very important to go to b2, because now after king d4, we're not actually forcing the king back to the first rank anymore. So after f6, rook f2, king a3, it turns out that white can hold this position in a different way with the rook on the side. This is also a famous Van Cora position draw, or whatever it's called. And we're just not in time to play like king d3 and exchange the pawns this way for sort of the same reason. The king can go to a3 and hold from the long side. But fortunately, my opponent missed this, because, you know, obviously he's going to. I don't think any human is actually going to find king b2 here. Maybe by necessity, I guess, but I'd be very impressed with anybody who found king b2 on increment. So then my opponent played king d2, and then the plan is, you know, kind of exactly what I said, very straightforward. We gain a lot of time making mate threats along the way. I repeated once for time, but now we can go ahead and trade these pawns. And after king b3, white is just not in time to set up the Philidor defense, and so, you know, we're threatening mate, white has to go here, and the rest is very straightforward. We'll go here, we'll put the rook on the a file, play c2, rook a1, and promote the pawn. So despite missing mate and 3 on the board, which I honestly don't, this is a weird tournament, man. A lot of a lot of really new things happened. You know, I don't think I've ever had somebody flag in a winning position against me, first of all. Well, I guess technically it was a drawing position by the time they flagged, but, you know, close enough. I don't think that's ever happened to me. I don't think I've ever just straight up missed mate and 3 over the board. I mean, maybe like in some random time scramble or something, but certainly not with so much time on the clock. Like I really wasn't in serious time pressure here. I still had like almost 10 minutes, I think. Like this is kind of inexcusable, and this is not a hard pattern. Like if you saw this in Puzzle Rush, it would probably be like a 1600 puzzle at best, maybe lower. So you know, not great, not a great sign, but we did at least manage to get the win anyway, which was good. And this was a very confidence boosting win, and still is a very confidence boosting win because this is again a very very strong opponent, and not just a strong opponent, but one that's been having good results recently as a young player. Like probably will be a GM sooner rather than later. This was so it was very satisfying to get this full point. I felt very very good about this one. It also meant that this tournament would sort of unambiguously be good, regardless of the final round result. And as we'll see, it's a good thing we built that buffer because the final round was a bit of a disaster, not just in the chess sense, but in sort of every possible way that you can think about a disaster. That was one of them. So getting this win was very very important for me. This was also my first win over a strong player in quite a while, to be honest. Where by strong player I mean somebody who's either a GM or basically a GM, very 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 close to one. At least since January, because I mean I haven't played many tournaments since then, but at least since January, where we beat a couple good players in the Blitzfield Invitational. And so it was nice to remember that, okay, no matter how bad it gets, I still have a little bit of danger left in me. People can't totally relax when they get paired against me. They do have to at least pretend to take me seriously a little bit. I am capable of winning a game or two. And so I was very, very happy to get this win and not quite end the trip because there was one more game left, but sort of start to close down the trip with a solid victory. I will see you next time for the final game. Thank you all for watching. I pre-warning for, well, I had to give a pre-warning for this one because seeing this position on the board and not giving mate in 3 is a little bit disgusting. But pre-warning for the next one. The next one was, well, there were some extenuating circumstances, so I'll give myself a little bit of an excuse, but it was not my finest performance. So you can all look forward to watching me get a big confidence boost off this game and then immediately erase at the next one. Thank you all for watching. I will see you next time for the exciting conclusion to the final round of the Menorca Open.